Hey folks, I'm very excited today because you and I, are going to be working on something I've never done before. Now, to be clear, I have made water thingies before, but whenever I have done it, I have always just gone with a glossy PVA and toilet paper routine. If you don't know what that is, it is basically just layering some glossy PVA or varnish over the top of some glued down crumpled toilet paper. It's crude but effective. However, the method we are going to try today is something my dad would always do. I will clarify, my dad made dioramas and model train layouts. He's never dabbled in Dungeons and Dragons or Warhammer stuff, but the idea is the same. I saw him do this method so many times and he always said it was common among the oldies. I had forgotten about it until recently when I went into my local craft store, which first and foremost is a store where you buy things, obviously, but on top of that they have a little area where you can just go hang out, play games like Warhammer or Dungeons and Dragons or even Pokemon and stuff. You can also craft, and when I was in there I saw somebody using this method to make wet muddy train track trails on their diorama, and it just looked cool. Now, my dad only ever used this for small things like puddles and stuff, but I want to try it on bigger things like ponds. Now, I'm the first to admit I have no clue how to do it. I make quite a few mistakes in this project and I'm going to leave all that in the video. Sure, I could do what many crafty YouTubers do and edit out all the mistakes and things that go wrong, pretending that I work flawlessly every time. But I don't want to be like that. I want to show you what trouble pops up and show you ways you can face it in case you go through the same issue. I want to be open and honest with you on this journey. I'm not a professional. I'm far from a master. I'm just somebody who likes doing this stuff. Now, I've rambled on, so let's make a quick cup of tea and get started. We are going to need some XPS foam. This will probably work on EPS, but I've never tried, so who knows. I can't see why not, but don't take my word for it. I just used scraps that I had spare, and I shaped the edges into rugged, messy edging because smooth edges just don't look right. And please cut more responsibly than I do. I could have sliced my wrist open doing it this way. It was a moment of stupidity from me. Try and point the sharp edge away from you, not towards you like this dummy. With the base ready, I drew a rough shape of where I wanted the pond to go, and then I got nail varnish. Yeah, you heard that right, nail varnish. I used top coat and base coat and both work the same, so if you are struggling to find the right one in your local stores, just look for top coat, base coat or clear coat. I got mine from B&M and Poundland. Then it was just a case of spreading it on, and as you can see, it actually melts the foam. Not super fast, but it does slowly melt it, and when it does melt it, it leaves a really cool and unique pattern behind. Something to note here, as you layer it, the fumes get really strong, so do make sure you are in a very well ventilated area if you don't want to go outside, which is likely the better option. Once you have covered all of the area that you want to melt, put it aside to dry and work on another piece. Patience isn't one of my strong points, and I ended up just pouring some of it on and spreading it out. Like I mentioned before, this is my first time and I underestimated how much more it would melt because it was doing it really slow, so it looked like it wasn't doing anything, and then I stepped away and came back and it ended up melting all the way through in many parts, but that was an easy fix. Once you've covered everywhere, you can kind of tell after 5 minutes how it's going to be, and if you want it to go deeper, just add a little more of the nail varnish in the deeper areas that you want. Once I realised it's going to melt through the parts, I used wood glue to stick the bases to some chipboard. I'd recommend doing that before you start with the nail varnish though, unless you are 100% confident that you won't put too much on like I did. Once you're done gluing and nail varnishing and all that, just weight it down and keep the chipboard flat to stop it from warping, because it does warp very easily from most forms of moisture. When the nail varnish is completely dry, it becomes hardened, which is a very good bonus. And if you do go all the way through and have to glue it to some chipboard like I did, just go around the edges afterwards with some wood glue like this you can see in the video, just to make sure it's nice and sealed, as we will be using resin later and we don't want it to leak under and out. For me, it was touch and go there for a while. I thought it was all going to just melt into nothing and go as wrong as it could go, as I used way too much. But this is what I was left with, and I was pretty confident going forward. Next, I wanted to texture the upper areas of the build that would act as the verge or banks of the pond edge. I started by covering all those areas in a coat of undiluted PVA glue. I tried to use a mixture of materials to stop it from looking suspiciously repetitive, so I put some rocks on there, some rubble mix and some chunky sand. I also had a couple of cast-in plaster rocks left over from my modular terrain tiles video, so I threw them on too. It was a messy task because I'm a messy worker, but I placed an oven tray under the project as I worked on it, which allowed me to catch all the excess and reuse it instead of it going to waste. After that, I picked it up and smacked it on the bum to knock off bits that were not taken by the glue. Then I used a pipette to spread some iso alcohol across the top of it all. The reason I used a pipette is because my spray bottle broke, so usually I'd just spray it on, but there you go. This would allow the glue to spread into every nook and cranny. Finally, I gave it a top coat of more PVA to ensure it was all going to be really sealed into place. With that out of the way, I took some Mod Podge, added some black acrylic paint to it. It's just cheap acrylic paint from Hobbycraft, and I coated them all entirely in that, including the pond floors. I've explained my reasons for this before, but just in case you are new to the channel, I do this because it will dry solid, reinforcing everything. Unlike PVA, Mod Podge has some kind of varnish in it that makes it seal really well, and generally speaking, no matter what I'm making, I always have a stage that includes coating it in Mod Podge just for that extra oomph. The reason I added black acrylic is just so I can see where I missed, and also to act as a primed base coat kind of thing. It will take a couple of hours to dry, but I hate the off chance that it might still be a bit wet when I get back to working on it and messing up my progress, so I usually leave it overnight, especially because I want to make sure that the varnish inside is nice and solid and set properly. You don't have to do that, but I do recommend at least making sure it's all 100% dry and sealed before you continue any further. I spent some time binging several hours of The Good Doctor. I don't know why I like that show, but I just can't get enough of it. I liked Freddie because of his acting skills in Bates Motel, which I thought was a brilliant show. I'd recently finished rewatching the entire season of The Last of Us and had run out of stuff to watch, so I thought I'd give it a try, and now Good Doctor is a guilty pleasure of mine, don't hate me. When I finally did come back to my desk, the pieces were all ready for the next step. I wanted to get some base colours down on everything except the ponds themselves, and I used these colours that you can see on the screen. I'm also going to be using my homemade camo shade. If you want to know how I made this, I'll put a link to the video in the description. I'll also be using my homemade dry brushing palette. There's a link to that too in the description. For a brush, I'll just use this cheap round brush that I bought ages ago from Amazon. The first step was the dark grey. I put this everywhere except for inside the ponds. I had decided that the sides of the builds were going to be like rocky ledges, so they got the most focus, but I still made sure every one of the builds got an all over coat in it. Then I repeated the same step with the light grey to further bring out some of the additional highlights. I added some white to the light grey to make it even lighter, but wiped most of the paint off my brush before applying it to the project. I took my homemade camo shade and applied it generously everywhere that I intended to be grass. It would most likely be covered up in the future further down the line in this project, but just on the off chance that some of the flock didn't stick or gets chipped away in the future and stuff, I wanted it to show a greenish hue underneath rather than a rocky grey. After that, I washed the entire thing in some of my homemade black wash. If you're following along with this, don't bother because I ended up not liking it. It goes on dark but lightens a bit when it dries. I was fine with it at the time as I really only wanted it to be a subtle tone of colour, but in the end I did decide I didn't like it. One thing to note though is that I did apply this black wash whilst the camo shade wash was still wet so that the two would blend together and layer on top of one another, so make sure to do that if you do apply the black wash. The ponds themselves is where I really had fun. I had 6 builds, 7 if you include a spare that exists solely as a place to pour excess resin later, and I decided that I would have 3 colour schemes, 2 of each. The The first one was blue, a bright and vivid body of water. I started with a dark blue. It's an acrylic from Hobbycraft called Peacock Blue. I covered the whole pond interior with this, not too thick of a layer as I didn't want to lose the cool nail varnish texture, but thick enough to cover it all evenly without the need of a second coat. Whilst it was still wet, I took a bright blue, a turquoise actually, and painted around the edges and the areas that I wanted to indicate were not as deep as the other parts. For the second colour scheme, I started with a deep darkish brown, doing exactly the same thing as I did with the blues. For the brighter tone, I went with an orangey brown, circling the edges and blending the two together roughly. I also stippled in a little bit of a pastel green just to add some variation to the tone. Finally, with the third colour scheme, I started with a rich emerald green and then circled it with a vivid lime green. Once I had them blended together enough for my satisfaction, I stippled some of that pastel green in there too. I let it all dry completely and then went back with the brighter colours, so the bright turquoise blue, the lime green, the orangey brown and so forth, and I dry brushed random areas because I loved the texture of that nail varnish and I wanted to emphasise it as much as possible. A thing to note at this point is I didn't bother cleaning my brush at all, so when I dry brushed the blue in and it was time to dip into the green to do the dry brushing on the green, some of that green did mix with the blue and go into the green pond, but I liked that, it worked really well. It was after I had done all this that I had decided I didn't like those rocky ledges and it was because of the black wash, so I repainted them all in a very dark bluish grey, along with some of the rocks on top and inside the ponds just to bring them out and make them differentiate from the base colours. Then I gave those areas a quick dry brush in plain white. I want to leave the resin until the very end, so before we get to that stage it's time to flock. I start by putting undiluted PVA everywhere that I had previously put texture, so that's all around the chunky sand and the rubble mix and the rocks. Those of you who follow my videos know my system for flocking by now, but I'll always explain for those who are here for the first time and haven't seen my other videos. I have a 3-stage system with the flocking. I have my lightest flocks, which I call the highlights, my darkest flocks, which I call the shadows, and then my medium flock, which is the main one. I sprinkle my highlights wherever I would put areas that are most exposed to the sun, meaning out in the open and on highlighted edges. The shadows I put where the sun doesn't often get to because, well, it's in the shadows, like at the foot of obstacles such as cliffs and rocks. Then the main blend, I just go over everything to bond to whatever glue hasn't yet got flock on it. It's a relatively simple process, yes, and I can make it far more complex when, for example, I need to do something to a professional standard. I would use many more different layers, but for me and my personal things, it's such a fantastic level of realism. And I have tried flocking in so many ways, and this is just by far the most effective way to make realistic grassy areas with a simple method. After tapping off any excess and putting that aside for future moss blends, I cover all the flock in a layer of iso alcohol and watered down PVA glue, mainly to make sure that when it all dries it's all solid and in place. If I didn't do this, the bottom would dry solid but the top would be a little bit fragile and easily brushed off. Adding this top layer of ISO and PVA just makes it a consistent solid layer throughout that is going nowhere. And yes, you could do it without ISO, but the PVA wouldn't be as effective in solidifying the layer because the ISO allows that PVA glue to get into every nook and cranny. The other reason I do this is because these brands of flock had a dye that reactivates when wet, so it allows the colours of all the different shades to blend smoothly. Whilst it's still wet, I sprinkle more flock on top. Initially, the flock that I showed you in the beginning was fine flock, but this time I'm adding coarse flock. It's a little clumpier and it adds variation to the level, stop it from looking like a completely flat area of land, like an artificial football pitch for example. It does make some of the dye trickle into the pond area, and I dabbed it with a tissue when it got too much, but I actually quite liked the little stain it was giving because it gave the effect of algae and stuff hiding underwater, which was great. Next step was to add some clump foliage. I had 2 shades, medium and dark, for variety. I also had some different tufts in various shades of green. I do only have yellow flowers right now, but as soon as I can afford it, I plan to get more, as the bigger your variety and choices, the better the overall look in my opinion. To put this in place, I picked a spot where I wanted it to go, and then I put a little bit of super glue there and just pressed it down. The flowers and tufts are self-adhesive, but I never trust that. I've had them come off many times in the past, so I glue them down too. And then there were these yellow things. Now on the packet it says that they are for wheat fields and stuff like that, and I saw them on the shelf and it is literally just this stuff crammed into the packet, and I assumed they were the same as some tall crops that I had gotten in the past. The difference was, in the past the tall crops that I had gotten had some kind of hot glue clump at the base to keep it all together neatly, and you literally had to just glue the clump to the base of your model and it was job done. With this stuff it was all completely loose and an absolute pain in the butt for me to glue in place tidily. Like seriously, I have no idea what the trick is to this stuff, because for me it was just a mess. And as you can see, I do end up raging a little bit, but in the end I managed to do what I wanted to do for the most part, so I left it at that. I didn't go as overboard as I planned to go. I was going to put it all the way around some of the ponds, but after this annoying me like it did, I just left it at a couple of clumps. The final step of this stage was a few drops of ISO on top of each one, and then a few drops of PVA to lock it all in. And now, disaster strikes. In all my crafting adventures, I had only ever played with one resin, and that's the 2-part resin that is usually used as a form of bonding glue. The cheap stuff that comes in a syringe that's split into 2. I get it from Poundland, other places sell it too, where mostly it costs around £3 to £5, but with Poundland, they sell it much cheaper for £1.50. Now, I've only ever used it with mica or mica, whatever you pronounce it in your region, or dye in it, so it becomes opaque when I use it and I never have to worry about the transparency ability, like in my ruined temple video, which I'll link in the description. The summoning portal at the end of that video was this resin with purple mica and some glitter in it, and it worked perfectly because it didn't need to be transparent. I don't really know what this stuff looks like without any colourant in it, or at least I didn't until now. I made this resin exactly like I always have. I cut the syringe open, squirted it into a cup, and then I added some acetone to thin it. I poured it into the pond and it was perfect. Then I left it to set, and when I returned, well, you can see for yourself in the picture on the screen, it went completely opaque with cloudiness. To me, it just looks like watered down milk or slightly diluted PVA poured into there. In any case, it looks absolutely nothing like a pond and it ruined the entire thing. So, I gave up. I turned off my desk lamp, I walked away from my desk in a sulk, and I didn't go back. 1 day passed, then 2, then a week, and I was still pissed about it. Sorry for my language, but I was pissed about it. I avoided my desk still. I went out on that day, a week after the cloudiness, and I went to the store to get a few things, and whilst I was in the range, I came across a 2-part epoxy resin that is designed for stuff like this and claims to dry clear. I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty poor. I can't work for personal reasons and I don't get much income, so buying professional resin wasn't really an option for me at this time. However, this one was quite cheap. Rather than the £50 stuff that I see online, this was just £10. I was still unsure, as it was still epoxy resin as opposed to polyester resin that's supposed to be the best according to YouTube videos, so I had the fear in mind that it would just go cloudy like the other epoxy resin I used. In the end though, I took the chance, I bought it and I went home. Back at my desk, a week after quitting the project, I considered my options for saving the dodgy cloudy one. I could have just covered it up with flock, but instead I decided to use another one of those cheap £1.50 epoxy syringes, only this time I put green ink in it, and then I poured it over the top and also into the neighbouring hole on this actual piece. I think it worked really well to make a swampy pond, considering it was just a salvage. I did notice something odd though. After I poured it, I then sprinkled a few tiny leaves that I had bought from the brand Knock on top to imitate vegetation, and when the resin dried, it had recoiled away from the leaves. Like, I don't know if you can tell in the picture, but there literally is no resin on the leaves or within about a millimetre of the leaves, it just recoiled completely. But it didn't matter. I think it still looks okay, and though not as good as I would have liked, I don't think anyone will be able to tell that it was a cover-up after a bad paw. Let me know in the comments what you think of the result and what you would have done instead. But anyway, putting that one aside now, I lined up the others and got ready with a brand new, apparently top quality epoxy resin in hand. You mix this new stuff in a 50-50 ratio, so I just put out 2 plastic cups and poured the resin into one and then matched that with the same amount of hardener in the other. Then it was just a case of mixing them together, and the instructions say that it will go slightly cloudy and to keep mixing until it goes back to being clear. Once I had done that, I did add a couple of drops of blue ink that I had just to add some colour, but not so much just to take away the transparency. Then I went ahead and filled up all the ponds with it until just about level, but not quite. I know some resin can expand as it is setting and spill over the tops, but to be honest, I was kind of hoping it would do that, as that would just make the shores look moist like most pond areas. How many of you cringed when I said the word moist? I can't be the only person who hates that word. Once I had done the pours, I found that the bottom of the ponds were looking a little bare. I hadn't put enough vegetation in there earlier when I had my clump foliage out. But it was no big deal, I just grabbed some more random bits and dropped them in there whilst the resin was still in liquid form. Then I poked them under with a stick until it was dense enough to my liking. The final and finishing touch was to use some of this water surf foam effect just to dabble around the edges of some areas. If this had been moving water like a river or something, I would have used a lot more of this, but since these were still water stagnant kind of ponds, there really wouldn't be that much surf to begin with, so I just really experimented just to see what it would look like. With the project finished, I'm sure you guys know what time it is. That's right, it's time for the kick-ass, badass, epic, and probably lackluster, to be honest, montage. Here we go. Well, we had some challenges there, but we got through it and we did it. It's okay to have a little sulk from time to time, and when your project's not going your way, it's okay to step away, take a break like I did. I sulked for a whole week when the resin went wrong. I think I binged so many different shows then, I couldn't even list them right now, I don't know, but I wasn't interested, so I stepped away, calmed down, took a breather, and then out of the blue, unexpectedly, I found myself inspired to go back to it again, and that's absolutely okay. I hope you like this video. I hope you find these little strategies and tricks and stuff useful, and I hope you will subscribe, hit the thumbs up, tell your friends, help me grow this channel. Thanks for everything so far, I really do appreciate it. We're nearly at 1,000 subscribers, and I never thought I'd even reach 10, to be honest, so thank you all, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now. Toodaloo.